Welcome to today's deep dive. We are incredibly glad you're here joining us for this one.
Yeah, we have a really fascinating topic lined up for you today.
We absolutely do. So we've got a stack of excerpts from Morgan Housel's book, The Psychology of Money. And our mission for this deep dive is, well, we essentially want to completely dismantle this idea that finance is a math-based hard science.
Right, like it's just about spreadsheets and formulas.
Exactly.
Right.
We want to prove that it is actually a soft skill. It's really the study of human behavior, emotion, and, psychology.
Yeah.
And to set this up, I want you to picture a tech executive. He's in his late 20s, and he is legitimately brilliant.
Like patented technology, brilliant.
Yes, he designed and patented a key component in Wi-Fi routers. He sold a couple of companies, made more money than most people will see in, a dozen lifetimes. But his relationship with that money was just completely unhinged.
Oh, the brick of cash story.
Yeah, the brick of cash. He would literally walk around with a brick of $100 bills, like several inches thick, just to make sure everyone in the room knew he was the wealthiest guy there.
Which is just, a wild insecurity flex.
It really is. And the absolute peak of this behavior happened on just a random afternoon. He hands a colleague a few $1,000s in cash and orders him to go find a jewelry store to buy several solid gold coins.
And to be clear, this was not to invest in, not to put in a safe.
No. He and his buddies took those solid gold coins down to a dock overlooking the Pacific Ocean, and they proceeded to skip them into the water like rocks.
Just skipping gold.
Just laughing, throwing thousands of dollars into the sea, arguing over whose gold coins skipped the furthest.
It's hard to even wrap your head around that.
I know. And a few days later, this same executive is at a high-end hotel restaurant. He accidentally knocks over a lamp and it shatters. The manager comes over, visibly annoyed, and says, it's a $500 lamp. It needs to be replaced.
And the guy just loses it.
He completely loses his mind. He is so insulted by the manager's tone that he pulls out his brick of cash, peels off $5,000, throws it at the manager, and says, "Now get out of my face and don't ever insult me like that again."
It is the ultimate display of ego.
Yeah.
Just completely divorcing itself from reality.
Totally. And you can probably guess the punchline here. It didn't take long for him to go completely hopelessly broke. But I want to contrast that tech genius with a man named Ronald Read.
Oh, this is such a stark pivot.
It really is. If you looked up Ronald Read's biography, the bullet points are remarkably humble. First person in his rural family to graduate high school, and he accomplished that by hitchhiking to campus every single day.
Wow.
Yeah. And after that, he fixed cars at a gas station for 25 years. Then he spent 17 years sweeping floors at JCPenney. At age 38, he bought a tiny two-bedroom house for $12,000 and lived there for the rest of his life.
I think his main hobby was like chopping his own firewood. Right?
Literally chopping firewood. A life defined by an almost radical simplicity. But when Ronald Read died in 2014 at the age of 92, this rural janitor made international headlines.
Because of his net worth.
Because of his net worth. That year, out of nearly 3 million Americans who passed away, fewer than 4,000 had a net worth of over $8 million. And Ronald Read was one of them.
It's just dang.
He left $2 million to his stepkids and over $6 million to his local hospital and library. And people were totally baffled. They assumed he must have won the lottery or, inherited some secret fortune. But he didn't.
He just saved.
He just saved what little he could from sweeping floors, and he invested those small savings into blue chip stocks.
And we should probably clarify what a blue chip stock actually is for anyone who isn't steeped in all that market terminology.
Yeah, please do.
We're talking about massive, deeply established companies. The kinds of businesses that are household names, that have a long history of weathering economic storms. And crucially, they usually pay out regular dividends. So they aren't the flashy, get-rich-quick tech startups. They're the slow, boring, relentless engines of the economy.
Exactly. He bought those boring, reliable companies, and then he just waited for decades. Which brings us to the third character in this opening triad, a guy named Richard Fuscone.
Who is basically the exact opposite of Ronald Read.
Entirely. Harvard-educated, a prestigious MBA, a tremendously successful executive at Merrill Lynch. He was so successful in the world of high finance that he retired in his 40s to become a philanthropist.
He was on all those prestigious 40 under 40 lists.
He was. But in the mid-2000s, Fuscone took out massive loans to expand an 18,000-square-foot mansion in Greenwich, Connecticut. We're talking 11 bathrooms, 2 elevators, 7 garages, indoor pools with see-through dance floors.
A see-through dance floor. That is Wow.
Yeah, and the maintenance alone cost over $90,000 every single month.
And then the 2008 financial crisis hit.
The crisis turned his highly leveraged finances to absolute dust. He went bankrupt, the estate was foreclosed on, and eventually sold at auction for like 75% less than it was worth.
So brutal.
So you have a brilliant tech executive who goes broke, a Harvard finance whiz who loses everything, and a janitor who dies with an $8 million fortune.
What's fascinating here is how entirely unique this dynamic is to the field of finance. Like, if you take a step back and look at any other highly technical profession, the scenario you just described is biologically and physically impossible.
Right, it just doesn't happen.
Imagine a story about Ronald Reed, a janitor with zero formal medical training, somehow stepping into an operating room and performing a quadruple bypass surgery better than a Harvard-trained cardiovascular surgeon.
That would be absurd.
It is absurd. Or a gas station attendant designing a suspension bridge that is structurally superior to one designed by the world's top architectural engineers. We will just never see a headline about an amateur outperforming a top-tier nuclear physicist.
No, the bridge would collapse, the reactor would melt down. I mean, you can't fake hard science.
Precisely, because those disciplines are governed by unbreakable physical laws. But in investing, in personal finance, these stories not only happen, they are a known feature of the system. The fact that Ronald Reed and Richard Fustone can coexist in the same ecosystem proves there's a massive blind spot in how we are taught about money.
Because it's not just about the numbers.
Right. Knowing what to do, the formulas, the spreadsheets, the economic models, tells you absolutely nothing about what happens inside your head when you actually try to execute that plan under pressure. Finance is not a hard science. It is a highly emotional, psychological soft skill.
It's all about behavior. So if sheer intelligence or advanced education doesn't dictate your financial success, what does?
That is the big...
You have to look at Let's views the world. Which brings us to one of the most comforting yet fundamentally mind-bending ideas in our source material. The premise that no one is actually crazy.
Even when they do crazy things.
Right. People do seemingly insane things with their money all the time, taking out catastrophic mortgages, skipping gold coins into the Pacific. But the argument here is that no one is making decisions just to be irrational. We're all acting completely rationally based on our own microscopic sliver of lived experience.
It is a critical paradigm shift for how we judge others and ourselves. Like, every financial decision a person makes perfect sense to them in the exact moment they make it. It fulfills a specific need or checks a specific box based entirely on the unique mental model they've built to navigate their life.
Okay, let's unpack this. Think of your financial worldview like a regional accent. You don't think you have one, you just think you're speaking the language normally. It's everyone else who sounds funny.
Right, exactly.
But everyone else can hear your accent instantly. According to the data, your personal lived experience with money makes up maybe 0.0000001% of what has actually happened in the global history of finance. But that tiny microscopic sliver of experience drives about 80% of how you believe the world works.
The historical and generational divides really illuminate how profound this is. I mean, consider the Great Depression. The historian Frederick Lewis Allen wrote that the Depression marked millions of Americans inwardly for the rest of their lives.
It left a scar.
A permanent scar. It completely rewired their brains regarding risk, savings, and trust in institutions. But then consider John F. Kennedy. When he was running for president in the 1960s, he was asked by a reporter to describe his personal memories of the Depression.
And his answer caused a massive political uproar.
It really did, because he answered with complete honesty. His family possessed one of the great fortunes of the 20th century. He admitted that he had no visceral first-hand knowledge of the suffering.
He just didn't experience it.
He said his family had bigger houses, more servants, and actually traveled more during that era. The only tangible evidence of the Depression he saw as a young man was his father hiring extra gardeners just to give local men a job. Kennedy explicitly stated, "I really did not learn about the Depression until I read about it at Harvard."
Oh man, people must have been furious.
Oh, they were.
They were thinking, how can this guy run the American economy if he doesn't understand the most traumatic economic event of the century? But the underlying truth is, Kennedy wasn't crazy for his perspective, and the people hoarding cash in their mattresses weren't crazy for theirs.
Right.
You simply cannot genuinely recreate the power of fear and uncertainty by reading a textbook.
No amount of academic study can mimic the physical sensation of lived trauma. Like, A financial model can perfectly chart a historic 40% market decline, but a spreadsheet cannot model the feeling of coming home, looking at your kids, and wondering if you have made an irreversible mistake that will ruin their future.
That's so true. And this isn't just a vague philosophical theory, it is heavily backed by data. Economists Ulrich Malmendier and Stefan Nagel dug through 50 years of the survey of consumer finances.
Such a fascinating study.
It really is. In a perfectly rational mathematical world, people should invest based on their specific goals and the current valuations of the market. But that is completely disconnected from what humans actually do.
Their findings were remarkable. An individual's willingness to bear financial risk is tethered almost entirely to their personal history, specifically what the stock market and inflation were doing during their late teens and early 20s.
Just that specific window of time.
Just that window. That highly specific period of neuroplasticity permanently wires their financial baseline.
It's the sheer dumb luck of when you happen to be born. Like if you were born in 1970, the S&P 500 increased almost tenfold during your teens and 20s. You entered adulthood learning on a visceral level that the stock market is a miracle wealth-generating machine.
You buy and you get rich.
Yeah. But if you were born in 1950, the market was essentially flatline during your teens and 20s. It went nowhere. So you have two groups of incredibly smart, capable people separated only by the chance of their birth year, walking through life with completely contradictory, immovable views on how the stock market functions.
And this concept of starting conditions shaping our worldview applies just as strongly across cultures and socioeconomic classes, too. There is a deeply sobering anecdote in the text regarding Foxconn, the massive electronics manufacturer in China.
The working conditions story, that one really shifts your perspective.
It forces you to pause. So a few years ago, there was a major Western expose highlighting the brutal working conditions at Foxconn factories. Long hours, grueling repetitive labor, low wages. Western readers were understandably outraged. They called it a sweatshop.
Right, which from a Western baseline, it looks like a nightmare.
Exactly. But a Chinese commenter wrote a response about their own aunt, who had worked in one of these very factories. The commenter asked the outraged Westerners, "Do you know what my aunt did before she worked in one of these factories? She was a prostitute."
Wow, that immediately strips away the purely academic outrage.
It completely recontextualizes the reality. The commenter explained that for their aunt, being exploited by a capitalist boss in a factory for a couple of dollars a day was a massive, life-saving, dignified improvement over having her body exploited by multiple men for pennies.
That's incredibly powerful.
The commenter was actually offended by the American outrage, pointing out that Westerners were judging the factory against the baseline of an American middle-class office job, whereas the aunt was judging it against the baseline of extreme poverty and physical danger.
It's a heavy realization. Your definition of a nightmare job or a dream opportunity is completely dictated by where you are standing when you look at it, which perfectly tees up one of the most baffling financial behaviors in America, something that analysts constantly point to as proof that people are bad at math.
The lottery.
The lottery. The poorest households in the U.S. spend over $400 a year on lottery tickets. But simultaneously, 40% of Americans cannot come up with $400 for a sudden emergency.
Looking purely at the mathematics, it is completely irrational. I mean, you are taking your only financial safety net and setting it on fire for a probability of winning that is statistically indistinguishable from zero.
Right. Anyone with a spreadsheet would say, take the $400, put it in a high-yield savings account, and you solve your emergency fund problem. Why don't they do that?
Because the spreadsheet assumes the person buying the ticket feels they have access to the same traditional avenues of wealth building that the spreadsheet maker has.
Right.
If you are living paycheck to paycheck in a system where higher wages, moving to a safer neighborhood, or sending your kids to college without crippling debt feels structurally impossible, a lottery ticket isn't a mathematical investment. It is a psychological purchase.
They're buying a dream.
They are buying a fleeting, tangible dream of experiencing the exact same financial peace of mind that wealthier people already take for granted. We don't have to agree that it's a good financial strategy, but if we apply the no one's crazy principle, the psychological why behind the purchase makes complete sense within their mental model.
They aren't buying a return on investment. They're buying a moment of hope. And speaking of buying feelings, we have to look at how we judge our own desires versus how we judge others. I want to bring up the man in the car paradox. The author of
Mhm.
our source text used to work as a valet at a high-end hotel in Los Angeles, which is arguably the ultimate vantage point for observing wealth and status.
A front row seat to human ego.
Exactly. He would park Ferraris, Lamborghinis, Rolls Royces all day, and he admitted that it was his dream to own one of those cars. Why? Because he believed the car sent a clear, undeniable signal to the world. I have made it, I am smart, I am wealthy, you should admire me.
Right, that's the whole point of a luxury car.
But the paradox he realized was this: whenever a Ferrari actually pulled up, he never once looked at the driver and thought, wow, that guy is cool, I really respect him. Instead, he entirely ignored the driver. He looked at the car and instantly imagined himself sitting in the driver's seat.
It exposes the ultimate irony of luxury goods.
We buy these incredibly expensive items to be admired by other people, but the observers don't actually use your luxury goods to admire you. They use your goods as a benchmark for their own desire to be admired.
The guy driving the Ferrari is sitting at the red light thinking, everyone is staring at me with reverence.
Yes, but the valet on the corner is literally just using the car as a prop for his own internal fantasies.
It's a perfect illustration of how isolated our internal narratives are. We fundamentally misjudge not only our own motives for spending money, but the motives and the actual success of everyone around us. We are deeply wired to assume that visible success is purely the result of skill, intellect, and hard work. But that assumption blinds us to the two massive hidden forces that actually dictate outcomes: luck and risk.
The doppelgangers. This is where the narrative shifts from our internal biases to the external forces of the universe. We love the myth of the self-made titan, but the text breaks down the origin story of Bill Gates, and it is a masterclass in recognizing the invisible hand of luck.
It really is.
In 1968, Bill Gates attended Lakeside School in Seattle. Now, to understand the gravity of this, we have to remember what computers were in 1968. They were massive, room-sized mainframes. Most university graduate schools didn't even have advanced computers yet.
Right, they were incredibly rare.
But Lakeside had a visionary teacher who used money from a school rummage sale to lease a teletype Model 30 computer that was hooked up to a mainframe via a telephone line.
The concept of time-sharing a computer had barely been invented, and somehow, a group of 8th graders in Seattle had unfettered access to it.
Let's actually break down the sheer astronomical math of this luck because the numbers are staggering. In 1968, there were roughly 303 million high school-age people in the world. About 18 million of those lived in the United States. About 270,000 of those lived in Washington state. Just over 100,000 lived in the Seattle area. And exactly 300 of them attended Lakeside School.
You start with a global pool of 303 million teenagers, and you filter it down to 300.
It is a literal 1 in a million head start. Gates himself has openly said if there had been no Lakeside, there would have been no Microsoft. Now, no one is arguing that he isn't a genius or that he didn't work incredibly hard. He absolutely did. But that 1 in a million stroke of geographic and temporal luck was the necessary fuel that ignited his intellect.
But here is where the reality gets much darker, and where the text introduces the vital counterweight to Gates's story. For every stroke of extreme luck, there is an equal dose of extreme risk. And that brings us to the tragedy of Kent Evans.
Right. Most people know the Microsoft origin story features Bill Gates and Paul Allen, but there was actually a third member of this prodigy gang at Lakeside, Kent Evans.
Who's just as brilliant.
Gates has said that Kent was the best student in the class. They shared the same brilliant business mind, the same endless ambition. They would literally sit on the phone for hours scheming about being CEOs together. Gates fully believes that Kent Evans would have been a founding partner of Microsoft.
But he never got the chance to see that future.
He didn't. Kent Evans died in a mountaineering accident before he even graduated high school. The text notes that there are only about 36 mountaineering deaths in the U.S. every year. The statistical odds of being killed on a mountain while in high school are roughly 1 in a million.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, Bill Gates experienced a 1 in a million tailwind of luck. His best friend, equally smart and equally ambitious, experienced a 1 in a million headwind of risk. They are doppelgangers. Luck and risk are the exact same force, the exact same magnitude, just working in opposite directions. It proves a deeply uncomfortable truth, which is that the world is simply too complex to allow 100% of your actions to dictate 100% of your outcomes.
I understand the math, but I have to really push back on this. Because if we genuinely accept that outcomes are heavily dictated by random luck and uncontrollable risk, how are we supposed to learn anything?
That's the existential question, isn't it?
Yes, yeah. If I'm looking at a wildly successful entrepreneur and it's
Mm.
impossible to cleanly separate their actual skill from their dumb luck, what is the point of studying them? Are we supposed to just throw our hands up, assume it's a lottery, and stop trying to improve?
It's a very valid challenge. If it's all random, nihilism feels like the logical response.
Yeah.
But the text addresses this by looking at how society judges the extreme examples of outlaws and geniuses.
Yeah.
Take Cornelius Vanderbilt, one of the wealthiest Americans in history.
The railroad tycoon.
Right. He ruthlessly expanded his railroad empire, often completely ignoring legal constraints. At one point, one of his advisors pulled him aside and told him that every single transaction he had recently agreed to explicitly broke the law of New York State. Vanderbilt's response is legendary. My God, John, you don't suppose you can run a railroad in accordance with the statutes of the state of New York, do you?
Wow.
In another instance, he simply declared, what do I care about the law? Ain't I got the power?
See, when you are a historical billionaire, a quote like that sounds incredibly badass. It sounds visionary.
Precisely. Because he succeeded, history paints that flagrant law-breaking as a scrappy, visionary, competitive trait. We write biographies praising his boldness. But imagine if the courts had successfully shut him down. Imagine if he had gone to prison and his empire collapsed. We wouldn't call him a visionary. We would call him a reckless, arrogant criminal who got exactly what he deserved.
It's the exact same action, but the label we apply is completely dependent on how the coin flip of the outcome lands.
Exactly. Or look at John D. Rockefeller. A judge once called his business practices no better than a common thief, but he won the Monopoly game, so he's remembered as a cunning genius. Or a more modern example. In 2006, Mark Zuckerberg turned down a massive $1 billion buyout offer from Yahoo. People call him a visionary for sticking to his convictions.
But then you have Yahoo.
Right, when Yahoo turned down a massive buyout from Microsoft a few years later, the entire financial world mocked Yahoo's leadership as a bunch of fools.
The line between inspiringly bold and foolishly reckless is literally invisible until after the dust settles.
And this directly answers your question about how we should learn. The takeaway is not to give up. The takeaway is to stop obsessing over extreme individuals. The more extreme the outcome, whether it's becoming a billionaire or going bankrupt, the more likely it was heavily influenced by the extreme ends of luck or risk. You cannot reliably emulate Warren Buffett's luck.
Right.
Instead of trying to copy the specific daily habits of a billionaire, you need to look for broad, repeatable, mundane patterns of success across thousands of people.
Which opens up a huge question. If studying individual billionaires is a trap because their success is distorted by outsized luck, how is massive wealth actually generated in a reliable, mechanical way? It turns out true, sustained success is rarely about making one brilliant psychic move. It's about casting a massive, robust net and surviving the brutal, counterintuitive math of what statisticians call the long tail.
The mechanics of the tail are arguably the most counterintuitive concept in all of finance. Our brains are simply not built to understand it.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's talk about a man named Heinz Berggruen. He fled Nazi Germany and didn't show a tremendous amount of obvious promise in his youth, but by the 1990s, he had become one of the most successful art dealers of all time.
A total legend in the art world.
Yeah. In the year 2000, he sold a portion of his massive collection of Picassos and Matisses to the German government for over 100 million euros, and experts agreed that was a massive discount. So the natural assumption is that Berggruen was this psychic art critic. He could walk into a gallery, look at a canvas, and just know which artist would define the century.
That is the myth of the visionary stock picker or art dealer. But reality is entirely different. Investment firms have actually analyzed the portfolios of legendary art dealers like Berggruen. What they found is he didn't rely on psychic foresight at all. He basically acted like a modern index fund.
Wait, really? An index fund for art?
Essentially, yes. He didn't pick just a few pieces he loved. He bought vast, overwhelming quantities of art. He bought almost everything he could get his hands on.
So mechanically, 99% of what he bought might have been completely worthless, or at least mediocre.
Exactly. But the genius of his strategy was that it didn't matter. He acquired so much art and held onto it for so long that it guaranteed he would capture the tiny 1% of pieces, the eventual Picassos, that emerged as masterpieces.
And that 1% pays for everything else.
That tiny 1% tail event was so incredibly valuable that it drove the return of the entire massive collection. You can be wrong half the time, or even 99% of the time, and still make an absolute fortune if your few winners are in the extreme long tail.
And this isn't just weird, opaque art world stuff. You see the same math everywhere. You brought some staggering corporate data to back this up.
The business tails dictate our entire economy. Take Walt Disney. By the mid-1930s, Disney had produced over 400 cartoons. Most of them were short, they were beloved by the viewers, but financially they lost an absolute fortune. His first studio actually went bankrupt. He was constantly on the brink of ruin, and then in 1938 he released Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.
Which was a massive gamble at the time. An 83-minute animated feature.
A gamble that became the ultimate tail event. That 83 minutes of film earned $8 million in its first 6 months, which was astronomical in 1938.
Oh, yeah.
It paid off all of the company's debts, it bought a massive, state-of-the-art studio in Burbank, and it fully funded the company's future for decades. A single tail event completely wiped out the financial drag of 400 previous failures.
This is the exact same dynamic that drives venture capital, isn't it? We always hear about VC firms making billions, but their actual hit rate is terrible.
No, it is remarkably low. A firm called Correlation Ventures crunched the numbers on over 21,000 venture financings. They found that 65% of all startup investments lost money. The companies just failed.
65% just gone.
Gone. But half of 1%, just about 100 companies out of 21,000, earned 50 times their original investment or more. That tiny, microscopic half% fraction drives virtually all the returns and pays all the salaries for the entire VC industry.
Okay, but people know VC is risky. You expect startups to fail. What absolutely blows my mind is that this exact same dynamic applies to the boring, safe, public stock market.
It does, and it's terrifying if you don't understand it. J.P. Morgan Asset Management looked at the Russell 3000 index dating back to 1980. Keep in mind, these are established, publicly traded companies. They have HR departments and boardrooms. They aren't two guys in a garage.
Right.
And yet, the data showed that 40% of all companies in the Russell 3000 suffered a catastrophic loss, meaning they lost at least 70% of their value and literally never recovered. 40% of established public companies essentially crashed and burned.
But wait, how does the index survive that? If 40% of the companies are dying, shouldn't the index be plummeting?
You would think so. But the overall index has increased more than 73-fold since 1980. Why? Because effectively all of the index's spectacular returns over those decades came from just 7% of the component companies that massively overperformed.
That is insane.
The 7% tail dragged the dead weight of the 40% failures all the way to record highs. And this fractal nature of tails exists even inside the successful companies. Look at Amazon. Their massive overall valuation is heavily driven by one internal tail event, Amazon Web Services. Or Apple, whose modern empire is overwhelmingly driven by a single product, the iPhone. A tech giant will experiment with hundreds of failures like the Amazon Fire Phone just to find the one tail that pays for the next decade.
I love comparing this dynamic to stand-up comedy. Think of a legend like Chris Rock. When you sit on your couch and watch a flawless Chris Rock special on Netflix, the pacing is so perfect, you think every word out of this guy's mouth is pure gold. He just has the gift.
Right? It looks effortless.
But what you don't see is the reality of how that special was built. He doesn't just write an hour of jokes and walk onto an arena stage. He practices in tiny, empty comedy clubs in New Jersey for months. He walks on stage with a crumpled notebook, he fumbles his delivery, and he tells terrible jokes that completely bomb. He bombs repeatedly, night after night, deliberately, just to sift through the dirt and find the one-tailed joke that actually works. We only ever see the polished tales.
And that leads to a crucial, dangerous insight about our own behavior as investors. Because society only broadcasts the tales, the winning special, the successful iPhone, the billionaire, we assume that constant success is the norm. So when our own investments hit turbulence, we panic.
We think we're doing something wrong.
Exactly. But if failure and turbulence are entirely normal. The text brings up the concept of punctuated moments of terror to explain how wealth is actually built, using the story of 3 hypothetical investors, Sue, Jim, and Tom.
Oh, this is the perfect illustration of why staying cool matters more than being smart. Let's look at Sue first.
The premise is that each of them invests exactly $1 a month into the stock market from the year 1900 to 2019. Sue is the ultimate tail rider. She invests her dollar every single month, rain or shine, no matter what the news says. It doesn't matter if there's a looming recession, a world war, or a catastrophic market crash. She just blindly keeps buying.
Okay, and what about Jim?
Jim, however, is a bit more reactive. He invests his dollar only when the economy is good. Whenever there is a recession, he sells his stocks to hold cash and hide from the storm. And Tom tries to time the market even more carefully, waiting 6 months after a recession officially ends before he feels safe enough to get back in.
So after 119 years of this, what is the result?
Sue ends up with $435,000. Jim has $257,000. Tom has $234,000. Sue doesn't just win, she wins by an absolute mile.
But we need to explain why she wins and why Jim and Tom's strategy is so common despite being terrible. Because out of the 1,428 months in that 119-year period, over 300 of those months were during an official recession.
That's a lot of economic pain.
It is. Sue didn't win because she had a better algorithm. She won simply by surviving and staying invested during the 1% of the time when everyone else was terrified and selling. But why do Jim and Tom panic? It's not because they are stupid. It is evolutionary biology.
Exactly. When the stock market plummets, your brain does not process it as a math problem. The amygdala, the part of the brain responsible for the fight-or-flight response, hijacks your logic centers.
We're basically cavemen looking at spreadsheets.
Pretty much. For hundreds of thousands of years, if you saw a predator, running away meant survival. Loss aversion is hardwired into our DNA. So when Jim sees his portfolio drop 20%, his brain floods his body with cortisol and screams, "Flee to safety!" Selling feels good because it temporarily relieves that immense biological stress.
But the stock market isn't a savanna. Fleeing guarantees you miss the recovery.
Which is the profound takeaway. You don't need to be a financial genius to build wealth. You only need to do the completely average thing. Hold your investments during the specific moments when everyone around you is losing their minds. Your lifetime financial success isn't determined by how you act during the years on cruise control. It is determined entirely by how you act during those punctuated moments of terror.
Which perfectly transitions into the actual mechanics of how wealth grows over those massive long time horizons. The concept of the Ice Age compounding effect. This fundamentally changed how I conceptualize growth.
It's a beautiful analogy.
If we look at the geological history of the Earth, scientists know that the planet has been covered in miles-thick ice sheets during 5 distinct ice ages. For a very long time, scientists assumed that to get a result that spectacular a frozen planet, you needed a genuinely apocalyptic cause. They hypothesized brutal, ravenous winters or massive shifting tectonic plates or supervolcanoes blocking out the sun.
It's a natural human instinct. We assume that a spectacular, massive result must require the spectacular, massive cause.
Exactly. But eventually, a scientist named Milutin Milankovitch and later a meteorologist named Vladimir Kupin figured out the real culprit. And it was shocking because it wasn't brutally cold winters at all. The cause of an ice age is simply a moderately cool summer.
It is a brilliant, subtle nuance of planetary physics.
Let's break down the mechanics. You have a summer that just never gets quite warm enough to melt the previous winter's snow. So you have this incredibly thin, seemingly harmless layer of leftover ice that survives until the next winter. Because that base layer of ice is already there, it makes it much easier for the next winter's snow to stick around and accumulate, which means an even bigger ice base survives the following summer.
And here's where the physics of the albedo effect kicks in. Snow and ice are highly reflective.
Right. As the snowpack grows, it acts like a giant white mirror. It reflects the sun's warming rays back out into space, which makes the Earth even cooler, which, in turn, brings more snow. Within a few hundred years, a totally mundane, harmless, seasonal snowpack compounds upon itself until it becomes a continental ice sheet that crushes mountains. It wasn't a massive, violent force. It was a tiny, incremental change that was allowed to compound over time.
The lesson being that you do not need tremendous force to create tremendous results. If a system compounds, meaning the growth builds upon the previous growth, a very small starting base can lead to results that literally defy human logic. And this planetary physics lesson applies perfectly to the most famous investor of our time, Warren Buffett.
Oh, the Warren Buffett math is where human brains just short-circuit.
They genuinely do, because we cannot intuitively grasp exponential curves. At the time our source book was written, Warren Buffett's net worth was roughly $84.5 billion. He is constantly studied for his investing techniques, his value metrics, how he reads balance sheets. But here is the critical, mind-blowing statistic. $81.5 billion of that $84.5 billion was accumulated after his 65th birthday.
I need to repeat that to make sure it sinks in. $81.5 billion of his fortune came after he reached standard retirement age, after he qualified for Social Security.
It sounds absurd, but it's just math. We attribute 100% of his success to his investing acumen. And to be clear, he is a phenomenal investor. But his real secret, the actual engine of his wealth, is simply time. He started investing seriously when he was 10 years old. Yeah. Imagine if he had been a normal person. Let's say he spent his teens and 20s exploring the world and
Mm.
started investing with a very respectable $25,000 at age 30. And let's say he retired at age 60 to play golf and spend time with his grandkids. Even if he maintained his incredible market-beating 22% annual return during those 30 years, do you know what his net worth would be?
Not 84 billion.
Not even close. He wouldn't be worth $84.5 billion. He'd be worth about 11.9 million.
11.9 million. That is 99.9% less than his actual net worth.
Because the true magic of compounding the explosive parabolic curve of the graph only happens at the very, very end of the tail. To truly prove that time is more powerful than sheer skill, the text compares Buffett to Jim Simons. Jim Simons runs Renaissance Technologies, a quantitative hedge fund. Simons has compounded money at a staggering 66% annually since 1988. That is 3 times higher than Buffett's 22%. In terms of pure mathematical skill, no one on earth comes close to Jim Simons.
But Simons' net worth is around $21 billion, which is 75% less than Buffett's net worth. If Simons is mathematically 3 times better at investing than Buffett, why is he so much less wealthy?
Because Simons didn't find his quantitative investment stride until he was 50 years old. He has had less than half as many years to allow his returns to compound compared to Buffett. If Simons had earned his 66% return for the 70 years that Buffett has been investing, his net worth would be, and the math is almost unsayable, $63 quintillion.
63 quintillion. It's a number that doesn't even make sense outside of astronomy. It just proves that human brains are wired to think linearly, not exponentially. We think 8 plus 8 plus 8. We do not intuitively grasp 8 times 8 times 8 over decades. If time and compounding are the true, unstoppable engines of wealth, then the ultimate financial skill isn't actually the act of getting rich. It is the act of staying rich long enough for that compounding ice age to do its work.
Which brings us directly to the tension between two conflicting mindsets. Getting wealthy and staying wealthy require two completely different, almost opposing skill sets.
They really do. And the text introduces these devastating parallel stories from the year 1929 to prove it. Let's look at a man named Jesse Livermore. Leading up to 1929, he was the greatest, most famous stock market trader of his day. Now, during the infamous Black Tuesday crash, the market absolutely collapsed. People were losing everything. There were stories of ruined investors literally throwing themselves out of windows.
Just total chaos.
Amidst this chaos, Livermore returns home to a terrified family. But he sits them down and breaks the incredible news. He had actually shorted the market, he bet on the crash, and in a single day, he made the equivalent of $3 billion.
It was a stroke of absolute contrarian genius.
Ah!
But we should explain what shorting actually means because it highlights the risk he was taking.
Yes, let's break that down. When you normally buy a stock, your risk is capped. If you buy a stock for $100, the worst thing that can happen is the company goes bankrupt and you lose your $100.
Right. It goes to zero and you're done.
But shorting is the opposite. When you short a stock, you borrow shares from someone else and immediately sell them, hoping the price goes down. If the price drops to $10, you buy the shares back cheap, return them to the lender, and keep the $90 difference. But what happens if you are wrong? What if the stock price goes up to $1,000?
You are still legally obligated to buy those shares back and return them. Because a stock price can technically rise to infinity, your potential losses when shorting are infinite.
Exactly. It is incredibly dangerous. Well, Livermore was right. He made $3 billion and became one of the richest men in the world right at the start of the Great Depression. Now, contrast him with Abraham Germansky, a multimillionaire real estate developer. Germansky bet heavily on the roaring 20s market continuing to go up. When the crash hit, he was utterly ruined. He was last seen wandering the streets of Wall Street, tearing a piece of ticker tape into tiny confetti pieces, and he simply disappeared. It's a deeply tragic story of complete ruin.
But the narrative doesn't end in 1929.
No, it doesn't. And this is the sobering twist. Fast forward 4 years to 1933. Jesse Livermore, the genius who made $3 billion, gets completely drunk on his own success. He believes he is invincible. He starts making larger and larger bets. He uses massive amounts of borrowed money. And eventually, the market turns against him. He loses everything. By 1933, he goes missing for a few days, just like Germansky did. He eventually returns, but the shame and the financial ruin are too much to bear, and he takes his own life.
Germansky and Livermore ended up in the exact same tragic place. They were both undeniably brilliant at the art of getting wealthy. They knew how to take risks, how to be optimistic, how to put capital to work, but they entirely lacked the separate, crucial skill of staying wealthy.
I have to ask how we are supposed to balance this, though. It seems like getting wealthy requires optimism. It requires taking big swings, believing in yourself, and ignoring the naysayers. But staying wealthy requires the exact opposite. It requires frugality, paranoia, and a constant, lingering fear that everything you've built can be taken away by a random event. How do you reconcile two completely opposing psychological mindsets in one human brain?
This raises an important question, and the text argues it is perhaps the most vital psychological trait a successful investor can cultivate: the barbelled personality.
A barbell, like in weightlifting.
Exactly. You have to load weights on completely opposite ends of the spectrum with nothing in the middle. On one end of the barbell, you must be wildly optimistic about the long-term future. You must fundamentally believe that the arc of the economy, of innovation, and of human progress is up and to the right.
Okay, and the other.
Simultaneously, on the other end of the barbell, you must be incredibly paranoid about the short-term obstacles that could prevent you from surviving long enough to actually see that bright future. You have to save your money like a terrified pessimist, but invest your money like a visionary optimist.
That paranoia is what gives you longevity. And without longevity, you get wiped out. You end up like Rick Darren.
Ah, the cautionary tale of the third member.
In the investing world, everyone knows the legendary duo of Warren Buffett and Charlie Munger. But 40 years ago, there was actually a third guy, Rick Guerin. They all made investments together. They interviewed managers together. Buffett himself has openly stated Rick was just as smart as us. But while Buffett and Munger became household names, Rick Guerin disappeared from the spotlight. Why? Because while Warren and Charlie knew they would get wealthy eventually and weren't in a hurry, Rick was in a hurry.
He lacked the pessimistic paranoia. He wanted the returns faster, so he used leverage.
He used margin loans. And we need to explain the brutal mechanics of a margin call to understand his downfall. When you buy stocks on margin, you are borrowing money from your broker to buy more shares than you could afford with your own cash. It amplifies your gains when things go well, but the broker uses your stock as collateral for the loan. During the brutal 1973-1974 market downturn, the stock market dropped almost 70%.
And when the value of the collateral drops that severely, the broker issues a margin call. They demand that you immediately deposit more cash to secure the loan. If you don't have the cash, the broker forcefully sells your stocks to pay themselves back.
And they sell your stocks at the absolute worst possible time at the very bottom of the market. Rick Guerin got hit with margin calls. He was literally forced to sell his shares of Berkshire Hathaway directly to Warren Buffett at under $40 a piece just to cover his debts. Today, a single Class A share of Berkshire is worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Guerin was just as smart as Buffett, but he failed to survive the short-term chaos, so he completely missed the long-term compounding.
Survival is the whole game. The text points out an incredible statistic about the necessity of embracing this chaos. Look at the macroeconomic history of the U.S. economy over the last 170 years. During that time, the standard of living increased 20-fold. It is an era of unprecedented world-changing optimism and growth. But what exactly happened during those 170 years to get us here?
The list of destruction required to achieve that growth is relentless. During that 170-year period of a 20-fold increase in wealth, we lived through 9 major wars, 33 distinct recessions lasting a cumulative 48 years. 99.9% of all companies created during that time went out of business. 4 U.S. presidents were assassinated. We had global pandemics. The stock market fell more than 10% from its peak at least 102 times.
Progress and growth happen amidst relentless, unavoidable destruction. If you don't have the margin of safety, the paranoid cash reserves, the frugal lifestyle, the flexible timeline to survive those 33 recessions without panic selling, you will be wiped off the board before you can ever enjoy the 20-fold increase in the standard of living. Planning is undeniably important, but the most important part of any plan is planning on the plan not going according to plan.
So if the key to compounding wealth is surviving this brutal, unpredictable chaos over decades, we must eventually ask the existential question, when does the compounding end? What is the actual tangible goal of hoarding all this wealth and stressing over market crashes?
Which brings us to the philosophical core of the entire book, the ultimate dividend. We have to explore the concepts of enough and the definition of true freedom.
So what does this all mean? The text sets the stage with this brilliant, quiet anecdote about the author Kurt Vonnegut. Vonnegut and his friend Joseph Heller, who wrote the classic novel Catch-22, are attending a lavish party thrown by a billionaire hedge fund manager on Shelter Island. At one point, Vonnegut nudges his friend and points out that their billionaire host made more money in a single day of trading than Heller had earned from the sales of Catch-22 over its entire history. And Heller just looks around and responds, "Yes, but I have something he will never have. Enough."
Enough. It is such a simple, almost quaint word, but it is the ultimate kryptonite to the psychological trap of modern capitalism.
Because without a clearly defined sense of enough, you end up like Rajat Gupta and Bernie Madoff.
Two of the most incredibly tragic and fascinating psychological case studies in modern finance. Let's examine Rajat Gupta. His starting conditions were unimaginably difficult. He was orphaned as a teenager in the slums of Kolkata. But through sheer intellect and drive, by his mid-40s, he had become the CEO of McKinsey, which is arguably the world's most prestigious consulting firm. He sat on the boards of 5 public companies. He worked with the United Nations. He partnered on philanthropic projects with Bill Gates. By 2008, he was legitimately worth $100 million.
$100 million. Think about the math on that. A conservative 5% return on $100 million generates $5 million a year. That's almost $600 an hour, 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, while sleeping, doing absolutely nothing. By every conceivable metric of survival and comfort, he won the game.
But internally, he didn't feel like he had won, because his reference point wasn't the slums of Kolkata anymore. He sat on the board of Goldman Sachs, surrounded by literal billionaires. He didn't want to be a mere centimillionaire. The psychology of social comparison demanded that he join the billionaire circle. So, in 2008, during the peak of the financial crisis, Gupta learned in a confidential board meeting that Warren Buffett was going to inject $5 billion into Goldman Sachs to save the company. Gupta hung up the phone, stepped out, and immediately tipped off a hedge fund manager named Rajaratnam so they could trade on the stock bump.
He committed flagrant insider trading for a tip that made him, what, maybe $1 million in profit?
Exactly. He risked a pristine, globally respected reputation, immense multi-generational wealth, and his own personal physical freedom for money he didn't have and objectively didn't need. He went to federal prison. And the story of Bernie Madoff follows a remarkably similar psychological path. Before he started the infamous Ponzi scheme that ruined thousands of lives, Madoff actually ran a highly profitable, completely legitimate market-making firm. His legitimate business was making him between $25 million and $50 million a year.
Completely above board, he was rich.
Legitimately wealthy. So why risk everything to build a fraudulent house of cards? Because the ceiling of social comparison is infinite.
It's an unwinnable game. I think about professional sports. Imagine a rookie baseball player who gets called up to the majors making $500,000 a year. Compared to his hometown friends, he is obscenely rich. But he walks into a locker room and sits next to Mike Trout, who's making $36 million a year. Suddenly, the rookie feels completely broke. But then Mike Trout goes to a charity gala and talks to a hedge fund manager who took home $340 million that year. Trout suddenly feels poor. And the hedge fund manager opens the newspaper, sees that Jeff Bezos' net worth increased by $24 billion in a single year, and feels totally inadequate. You are always going to find someone standing above you on the ladder.
If your expectations rise faster than your financial results, there's zero logical point in striving for more wealth. You will feel the exact same level of dissatisfaction after putting in the grueling extra effort.
Which is why I love the quote from the Vegas dealer mentioned in the text. A guy sits down at a table and asks the dealer, "How do you actually win in a Las Vegas casino?" And the dealer just deadpans, "The only way to win in a Las Vegas casino is to exit as soon as you enter. You have to stop moving the goalposts. You have to decide what your definition of enough is before you start playing the game, or the game will consume you."
Because if you don't define enough, you lose sight of the highest dividend that money actually pays. And this isn't just philosophical musing. It is backed by psychological science. The text cites a massive 1981 study by University of Michigan psychologist Angus Campbell. He wanted to find out what actually makes people happy. He looked at all the standard metrics, income levels, geography, education, age, and none of those were the strongest common denominator for happiness.
So what was the variable that actually moved the needle?
Campbell found that having a strong sense of controlling one's own life is a more dependable predictor of positive feelings of well-being than any of the objective conditions of life we usually measure. More than the size of your house, more than the prestige of your job title. The ability to wake up every morning and say, "I can do what I want, when I want, with who I want, for as long as I want," is the ultimate return on investment.
Buying back your time. The author tells a great, relatable story about his own life to prove this point. When he was in college, he decided he wanted to be an investment banker. Not because he loved modeling spreadsheets, but simply because investment bankers made a ton of money. He hustled and got a prestigious summer internship in Los Angeles, and he thought he had won the lottery. But on his very first day, the reality of a job crushed him. He realized why they make so much money. You are a highly paid slave to the boss's demands. Going home before midnight was considered a rare luxury. Working weekends was mandatory. He actually liked the core analytical work, but the lack of control was so toxic that he only lasted a single month before quitting.
Psychologists have a specific term for this. It's called reactance. Humans have a deep, innate need to feel that they are in control of their own choices. When you are forced to do something, even if it is something you might have originally liked doing, you feel disempowered. Doing something you love, but on a rigid schedule that you cannot control, feels neurologically exactly the same as doing something you hate.
Reactance. It literally turns a dream job into a psychological prison. And this dynamic is more relevant today than at any other point in human history because of how the nature of our jobs has evolved. Look at the working habits of John D. Rockefeller. He was famous for literally just sitting in silence during meetings. A worker once noted that he just sat back in his chair, closed his eyes, and let everyone else talk.
Which looked incredibly strange to people observing him back then, because in the 1870s, almost all jobs required visible, manual labor. Agriculture, manufacturing, mining. Your work was physical, and crucially, when you left the factory or the field at 5 p.m., your work was undeniably done. But Rockefeller's job was to think. His deliverable was decisions, not widgets.
And flash forward to today, roughly 38% of the modern workforce are classified as knowledge workers. Our primary tool of production is our brain. We don't leave our tools on the factory floor anymore. We carry them in our heads, and we carry a portal to the office in our pockets via our smartphones.
The modern factory is no longer a physical place. It is the day itself. You might be physically off the clock sitting in your living room, but your brain is still churning over that marketing project while you're making dinner. Or you're waking up with a spike of cortisol at 3 a.m. because of an unread email. Because the brain never leaves the office, we never truly psychologically clock out.
Which completely explains the massive, counterintuitive spikes in modern stress. Think about it. The U.S. is the richest nation in the history of the world. Median family income has doubled, adjusting for inflation, since the 1950s. Our houses are literally 3 times the size they used to be. But despite all this material abundance, a recent Gallup poll shows that Americans are significantly more stressed, angry, and worried than the global average. We used our unprecedented wealth to buy bigger stuff, but in the process, we completely gave up control of our time.
The true purpose of wealth is not to buy a Ferrari so a valet on the street corner can imagine himself driving it. The true highest utility of money is to buy independence and autonomy. To have a 6-month emergency fund so you aren't terrified of disagreeing with your boss. To have the financial runway to wait for a job that respects your time rather than being forced to take the first one that comes along. Autonomy is the ultimate dividend.
Wow. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the psychology of money. We have covered an immense amount of ground today. We've gone from the 1 in a million luck of an 8th grade Bill Gates, to the reflective ice age compounding of Warren Buffett's billions, to the devastating tragedy of highly intelligent people who never figured out the definition of enough. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you with a final provocative thought to mull over. If your financial worldview is entirely shaped by the tiny 0.00000000001% sliver of history you happen to be born into, and if true, generational success is largely driven by hidden long tails and the silent, relentless ticking of compounding time, rather than your own sheer intellect, how much of your daily financial stress is completely unnecessary? Are you exhausting yourself trying to solve a deeply emotional, psychological puzzle using a cold, hard math equation?
It's a profound question to end on. We spend so much of our finite energy trying to optimize the spreadsheet while completely ignoring the mind that has to read it.
Exactly, because at the end of the day, when you step into the world of money, that diagnostic x-ray machine we so desperately want to rely on, it is permanently broken. There is no clean, white line showing you exactly where the problem is. There is only you, your unique experiences, and the chaotic, muddy waters of human behavior. Navigate them wisely. We'll see you next time.